right, so I just want to welcome everyone to our Skill Up today. It's titled Quant is Not Scary with Dr. Carrie Lloyd. I am interested to learn a little bit more about how it's not scary. My name is Jenna Johnson, and I am a learning specialist with the Academic Training Academy. I do have just a few things I want to cover real quick because I know that we have a packed session today. We are going to record it. We are going to post it in the Skill Up Center or the Skill Up page within the Graduate Studies Support Center, usually within 24 hours. We're saving some time at the end to answer questions, but you can use the Q&A forum at the bottom of your Zoom window during the session. But Dr. Lloyd is going to be answering questions all the way at the end. And then obviously our chat feature is also open. We do have scrolling subtitles enabled. You can turn these on if you hover at the bottom of the Zoom window. Click the CC option and choose subtitles, and then you can turn these off at any time. And with that, I'm going to turn it on over to Dr. Lloyd.
Thank you, Jenna. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited you're here to listen to me talk about quantitative research. I know it is not the most exciting thing. I'll never pretend it's fun. But it's really important. I mean, in your career, you'll obviously, whether you're doing research or not, you'll need to understand how to look up the best evidence in journals and be able to understand quantitative research. I also think it's really valuable just in your personal lives. We see a lot of people, especially in the last few years, that tend to just kind of believe everything they hear in social media and even on the news. You know, heaven forbid that the news is wrong. But I'm hearing things all the time, you know, especially lately on the news that is incorrect. And it's, you know, they're misunderstanding a correlational design, and they're talking about cause and effect, for instance. And so it really just helps you be a wiser consumer of information, I think, as well. But the reason why I named this Quant is Not Scary is in about my 15 years of being a professor in higher ed, and I teach a lot of statistics and research courses. I've written a lot of the research methods and statistics courses here. And, you know, I get all the time from students, you know, something to the effect of, you know, quantitative scary, or I'm not good at math, I'm not good at statistics. And, you know, really, if it's broken down in a little easier of a way and explained, I think, in a little bit easier of a way. For some reason, statisticians like to explain everything in the most difficult way possible, typically. I don't think it needs to be scary. And so I'm assuming that a lot of you are coming from different areas with research. Some of you might have to do a thesis. Some of you are in a program that might have to do a dissertation. But I'm going to try to break this down into some manageable steps that are true of really any quantitative research study. So this is just kind of a little bit about my background. I have two older kids. One just graduated college and one is still in college. So it's mostly me and my cute little pup there, Johnny Cash. So I apologize in advance if you hear him barking. Sometimes he likes to get in on the conversation. I have a PhD in psychology and a postdoc 2-year graduate certificate in advanced quantitative methodology and statistics. So that's where a lot of my quant, you know, background comes from. But I kind of have ended up on the education side of things, mostly stemming from my master's degree in educational psychology. So I specialized in measurement statistics within education there as well. All right, so just to kind of set the stage for what we're going to be talking about, there are 3 types of methodologies, kind of general methodologies. I'm only going to be talking about quantitative here. My kind of disclaimer, if you have to do any kind of thesis or dissertation, is to avoid mixed methods research like the plague. Just don't do it. It's very interesting, it's very important, it kind of mixes the best of qualitative and quantitative, but it is very difficult and very time consuming. And typically thesis and dissertations are already incredibly difficult and time consuming. So I would suggest just kind of staying away from that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the main designs in quant research, and I'm going to go over kind of the main aspects of a quantitative study, mostly in regards to alignment. In all of my years of teaching, the biggest problem I see with really quantitative or qualitative studies is alignment. In research, words mean very specific things. And so, for instance, if you say this, I'm trying to see if this variable has an effect on this variable, a researcher, anybody that understands research, will instantly think it's an experiment. So just by that one word, that tells us that it's an experimental study. And so words are really important, how you choose words and the alignment of words. Also, just your variables, your topic, the words are very important to stay the same. For instance, I see research studies all the time that will jump back and forth between things like attrition and retention. Then they'll say teachers are leaving the profession. And then, even some other very distant words like they're leaving because of burnout. But you're mixing all of these different words, and there's different instruments for each of those things. There's different meaning behind each of those things. We measure them very differently. So alignment is really important in research. And then one disclaimer I just want to say, I've been asked not to answer any question related to your specific dissertation or thesis topic. Only your chair or faculty can answer those kinds of specific questions. But I'm happy at the end to kind of answer any general questions you might have. So this is just kind of the general process of hypothesis testing. So in quantitative research, we go through a process to try to see if our null hypothesis, we either reject that or we fail to reject that. And here's where just already another kind of importance of wording is coming in. We don't ever say we accept the null hypothesis. Because we can't ever truly accept anything. Similarly, we can't ever say prove in research because we can't ever truly prove anything. But what we're doing in quantitative research is walking through these steps to see if our null hypothesis, which is kind of the common belief, the existing theory in literature, if we continue to reject or fail to reject that hypothesis. So we'll walk through kind of some of those main steps of hypothesis testing today. One thing that I think would be really helpful to you all as I talk over the next about 40 minutes is to write down some kind of little box if you have paper and a pencil in front of you. If you don't, no worries. But this is kind of what I would suggest doing as you're thinking about your study. So just write some kind of simple table like this, and then write no more than one sentence or just a few words in each of these boxes underneath these header words. And if you're seeing any different words in each of these as far as your main variables, you're out of alignment. So again, those are one of those things where if you kind of break it down, it seems a little less difficult. And then also when we get into things like the method and design, you can quickly go back and see, okay, does that align to the variables, the words, in my problem, in my purpose, in my research questions? When you get all the way down to the analysis, does this analysis actually answer my research questions? We can't have a correlational analysis if our research question had any kind of causal verbs like cause and effect, because those don't match, those aren't in alignment. So instead of looking at 20 pages of a research study to kind of check for alignment, if you do it this way, it's just a really simple way to check for those most important aspects of alignment. So another aspect of, I think, what makes quant scary is that different researchers use different words for the exact same things, unfortunately. But once you can kind of start writing those things down and keeping track of them, they don't seem, I think, as big of a deal. Some texts also just break down research a little bit differently. So I've actually seen a lot of textbooks here at National breaking down types of research by experimental or descriptive. So just those two categories, it's either experimental or descriptive. I'm used to talking about research in, let's see, there we go, wasn't pulling up for some reason. More breaking it down by methodologies. So qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods. So they're just breaking it down a little bit differently, but again, talking about similar concepts here. So experimental, if we're talking about just experimental or descriptive research, we're talking about with experimental, we're truly manipulating variables. And it's the only type of research that can distinguish cause effect. So again, keep in mind, any causal verb at all, it has to be an experiment or a quasi-experiment. And then with descriptive research, it's kind of everything else. We're just reporting what already exists. We're providing kind of a snapshot of the current state of the phenomenon. But again, I like to break it down by methodologies. So we have qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods. And then under quantitative is what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm sure most of you, if you have any experience in education or psychology especially, have heard of the Bobo doll experiment. So this is where they manipulated different scenarios, like they had the parents go into one scenario and be really aggressive with this Bobo doll. And then in another scenario, they manipulated it to where the mother was not. Typically it was a mother during this experiment, and the mother was not aggressive with this doll. And so they're manipulating the situations. And then the child would go in and they would see how the child would react to this Bobo doll depending on the manipulated scenario. And almost always the children would go in after the mother was aggressive and be very aggressive to this Bobo doll. And then the opposite was true of the parents that were not aggressive. The child would go in and play with this Bobo doll in non-aggressive ways. So that's just an example of how we're actually manipulating. We're changing the situation. We're not just going in and watching mothers, whether they're aggressive or not, and then just measuring that situation. So again, this quantitative and quasi-experimental, these are the only two designs where we can use any kind of causal verb. So cause, effect, or anything even remotely that will give the hint that one variable is causing a change in the other variable. It's also the only design where we want to talk about independent variables and dependent variables, because we have the independent variable and then such as manipulating the aggressive levels. And then the two, what we call levels of the independent variable would be being aggressive to the Bobo doll or non-aggressive. And then we have the dependent variable, which is the outcome variable. So we're measuring something. And in this case with the Bobo doll, we're measuring the aggressiveness of the child. So does aggressiveness of the mother cause aggressiveness in the child? And then one thing I also want to say, just with the difference between quasi-experimental and just true experimental, the only really difference there is that in quasi-experiment, we don't have a true random assignment to groups. So that's really important. Just in some situations, we can't randomly assign to groups, such as hair color. I can't, make some subjects have black hair color and some subjects have red hair color. And then sometimes it's just unethical to randomly assign to groups. If I'm doing a study on the effects of smoking, I can't randomly assign some people to a smoking group and some people to a non-smoking group. And then another really important aspect of experimental studies is that having a control group is always the best. If we don't have anything to compare it to, then we don't know if the effect is actually being caused by the treatment or the invention or whatever intervention, or whatever it is that we're studying. And then the next, so we've got the main designs are experimental, quasi-experimental, and then non-experimental. And the two main designs that fall under non-experimental are correlational and observational. So this is where a lot of people in the news and social media really have a problem with how they describe studies. For instance, I saw on the news once, they were describing a study that said something to the effect of drinking a glass of wine a day causes the same positive health effects as working out in the gym for a day. Unfortunately, that's not true. I can't imagine. That doesn't even sound real, right? So I actually went and looked up the study because I'm a true nerd. And it was a correlational study, of course. And this happens all the time where people use cause effect with correlational studies. Correlational designs can only tell us if two things are related. We have no idea how they're related, but just that those two things are related. So we can't ever use causal verbs when we're talking about correlational designs because there's a lot of different possibilities on how things are related. For instance, I saw a study once that said crime or higher ice cream sales causes a raise in crime. Again, that doesn't even make sense. But what it was a correlational study, and those two things were related. The more ice cream sales, somehow it was related to more crime. Well, my guess there is it's probably because it's hot. And so there's more ice cream sales when it's hot, and there's more crime typically when it's not, 20 degrees, below 20 degrees outside. And so we just don't really know how those two things are related. It could be that A caused B, or it could be just as equally that B caused A, or it could be a million other things, like any what we call C variables could be causing the relationship, or it just could be an accident that there's a relationship. So some key issues with correlational design is correlation does not equal causation. Again, you just want to be really careful with the words you use here and never use any kind of causal verbs. Don't discuss independent variables and dependent variables because again, that's denoting that one variable is causing a change in another variable, whereas we just have two variables here in correlational designs. And then we'll talk in a little bit about aligned analyses, but also just to keep in mind, there's a lot of different analyses that are aligned with experiments and quasi-experiments. But with correlational design, you can only have a correlational analysis. So it's kind of simple. So the main analysis is a Pearson correlational analysis. And if your assumptions, I won't go too much into statistics here, but if your assumptions are violated for what we call a parametric statistic, which is what a Pearson correlation is, then we have to go with some other non-parametric analyses. You can also do kind of a step above and do a regression. So if you do a regression, it's still a correlational design, but we're actually able, instead of just saying these two variables are related, we can say that this variable may predict this variable. So again, it's kind of like a halfway point between just a relationship and the cause and effect. And then just really quickly, there's the next non-experimental type of study is an observational design. You don't see a ton of these anymore because in the early days of education psychology, you had a lot of researchers go and kind of sit on park benches and observe kids and do observational research. That's a little creepy to see these days, right? Some person just sitting on a bench without a kid, just observing and taking notes about children. So we just don't see a ton of observational work these days, but we see them with some things. Here's just a couple examples. A lot of observational research with an animal research. A lot of observational research within a more tightly confined lab, like with a one-way mirror kind of thing. But this is essentially just having some kind of observation protocol and observing natural behavior. So how do you choose a design? A lot of people will choose methodology based on what they think is easier. But frankly, I really think you put the same amount of time and effort into qualitative or quantitative work. You have to know the best practices of both. But then also when you choose a design, it really should be based on your problem, purpose, and research questions. You shouldn't choose a design first. A lot of novice researchers do that kind of backwards. But we should really start coming up with a problem initially. This is another common problem I see with novice researchers is that they talk about the topic or what they want to research or what they want to find out through their research, but they skip the step of actually coming up with a problem. And this is really important because the point of research oftentimes is to try to gain insight into a problem. And just as a side note, we don't ever want to say solve a problem because we can't truly ever solve any societal problem. Most problems are huge. And so we want to try to gain insight into a problem though. If we don't have a problem, we're just doing research for the sake of doing research. So this is why I have this huge map as a picture here. Most societal problems are huge, right? They're just really big problems with a lot of different aspects involved in them. So if you think of like racism, world hunger, these are really big problems and there's just a lot of things that go into them. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to solve them. But what researchers do is we choose one piece of that larger puzzle of the problem. And if each of us do one research study, trying to gain insight into that one puzzle piece, that one smaller aspect of the problem, we can eventually start gaining insight into that larger puzzle, that larger problem. So try and identify a problem, has to be actually what bad is going on. So it has to be worded as the actual problem. And it needs to be very, very specific. And then just ensure you align it with your purpose. Again, kind of double check that you're using the exact same variables. If you say that the problem is a high attrition rate, then the purpose is to gain insight into that high attrition rate. You shouldn't switch to retention or anything like that. So just kind of check the alignment with those two. And then research questions typically then will come next. So you've got this problem that you're trying to gain insight into, and your research questions are kind of the overarching questions that your study is going to ask to gain insight into that problem. Just a side note, because a lot of novice researchers misunderstand that these are not the actual questions that you ask your participants. So that would come later in your instrument, how you're going to measure it, like a questionnaire. But these are just typically 2 to 3 questions that are kind of the overarching questions. And I linked some examples of research questions here, and you'll be able to get access to this PDF later if you want to check those out. Layered Statistics, if you're not familiar with it, is a great site for resources on a variety of aspects within quantitative research. So I just gave you 3 examples here, and I kind of just want to briefly point out how these questions are asking somewhat similar things to get to insight about a problem, with how TV and grades or academic achievement, those kinds of things might play a role. But they're asking very different things, and they're aligned with very different designs and analyses. So I want you to kind of take a look at just the different wording here. So this first one, is there a significant difference in TV usage behavior between male and female university students? So we can't, with this question, we can't put certain genders in certain groups. And I took this example off of Laird to kind of show the example of an independent samples t-test. But I also put this here to also point out how many unethical research questions we have out there, and we should really try to make our research questions more inclusive of everybody. So you will see questions like this all the time, just separating gender in male and female. Researchers are really trying to get away from those kinds of things, those kind of stereotypical things. And so that's just a huge thing I wanted to pause here for a moment and say, when you're doing research, try to really think through the different equity and different ethical issues with your study and just how you word things. So within this research question, they're trying to see if there's a significant difference between 2 groups, and we can't randomly assign them to groups. So this would be a quasi-experiment. And then the next one, does TV usage behavior cause a decrease in grades? Hopefully you caught that causal verb. And we just know off the bat, this has to be an experiment, right? It can't be a correlational study because we use that cause there. So here we're designing some kind of experiment to, have some students have more TV use and some students have less, or, this group of students have 10 hours, this group has 20, this group has 30, this group has 0. You can design it in any way you want. But we're essentially designing an experiment to see if TV usage behavior decreases grades. And then, we can measure grades and whatever you want to measure that with. And then this last one, if hopefully you notice the association verb. So this already tells me just from this research question that it's a correlational design, and we're going to have a correlational analysis. So to what extent does TV usage behavior relate to memory? So now we're just seeing if those two variables are related to each other. And then the next part of alignment is with your hypotheses. In every quantitative study, you'll have a research question, and then you'll have two hypotheses for every research question. You'll have a null hypothesis. That's what we do hypothesis testing with, is we're testing the null hypothesis. And then you'll have the alternative, or sometimes it's called the research hypothesis, but those mean the same thing. It's basically the null hypothesis is the common and accepted belief. It's what we're testing. And then the researcher's trying to see if something new happens. It's kind of what the researcher wants to see, something new other than the common or accepted belief. And then just ensure that they align with the exact words in your RQs. So when you're working on alignment, check two main things: that you have the exact same variables. So with my last RQ, if I'm writing a null hypothesis, I'd say TV usage and memory, and I'd write it exactly like that, those exact words. And then the next thing to look for in alignment with the hypotheses is that the null hypothesis says something to the effect of no, and the alternative says something to the effect of yes. And so along with my first research question, because I'm looking at a difference between groups, my null hypothesis would be there is no significant difference in TV usage behavior between male and female university students. My alternative research hypothesis would be there is a significant difference in TV usage behavior between male and female university students. So again, I think sometimes we try and make it more difficult than it is, but you just copy and paste and then change it slightly. And then I'm not going to say much about the literature review. Work with the Academic Success Center. They have great writing coaches in there for really any study. It's a lifelong learning thing to get better and better at scholarly writing. But essentially what I wanted to say here is use some kind of literature organizer table. So that's what I have here as a picture in the upper right-hand corner. And then I also linked one here under the lit organizer table. So this will help with your synthesis and critical analysis of the literature. And we want to ensure that we only use the same variables. Again, we don't want to go off on tangents, because with any large societal problem, there's a million different tangents we can go down, because there's so many things are related. There's not just one cause of world hunger. But in one study, we don't want to go off on tangents on all the different causes. We want to just stick to the variables that we're looking at. And so this organizer table will help you with that. It'll also help you to go beyond just describing the literature. Up through even college, most of the time, when you write a paper, you're just mostly describing a topic. What is depression? And you describe depression. Whereas a literature review goes a step beyond that. They definitely describe the situation, they describe the variables, but you also want to ensure you synthesize and critically analyze the literature. And so there's a lot more that goes into that than kind of what I'm able to have time to share right now. But essentially, think of synthesis is like looking at the current empirical research literature as a forest. So all these different studies, look at the different themes, the differences, the similarities. Again, this is what this organizer table will help with. And we're trying to ultimately give the reader a general state of the literature on this topic. So what does the topic say about TV and memory right now? And then a critical analysis is like looking at an individual empirical study like a tree. So you're analyzing just that one article for its unique aspects with, how good is the methodology? Did they have a really low sample size? Did they only study one particular population instead of being inclusive of everybody? And now they're trying to make these general comments about the conclusions to all different types of people. That's another issue within quantitative research that a lot of people don't understand, and they can make a lot of false assumptions based on if the study was not inclusive to different populations. Now, you can make it very clear, like you're only studying freshman college students, and that's fine if that's your population. But for instance, where it gets into not only ethical and inclusivity issues, which it does, but it also is dangerous sometimes if we do things like early quantitative research when they were studying the effects of certain depression drug medications. They studied basically white middle class male adults, and then they generalized the results to kids. And so then kids, what happened is they had a really hard time with these depression medications, and in a lot of cases, it increased suicide rates. So we need to be really careful, and both are important to look at literature to judge the effectiveness and the validity of the literature. We need to look at the individual study and all the aspects of that study, and then we need to put it in context of the greater body of literature. So the next aspect of alignment is what we call a sampling technique, or sometimes you'll see this called a sampling method. They mean the same thing. It's essentially how we're going to collect our participants, so how we're going to get our participants. And with experimental or quasi-experimental, the best sampling methods are always probability sampling methods. So there's several different probability and non-probability sampling methods. I'm not going to go into each one in depth. On the next slide, I give some definitions in case you'd like to look into them a little bit further. But essentially what I want you to know is that probability sampling methods are random. And so everybody in the population has an equal chance of being selected for our study. And so this has to be, when we say that we're using random sampling, we have to ensure that we're actually doing random sampling, because that really means something. That's really the only way we can generalize to a greater body of people, is when everybody in our population truly has an equal chance of being in our study. And the non-probability sampling methods, they're not random. They're more like convenience, and just, I go out and set up a table somewhere and just ask people to be part of my study, or I just go ask for volunteers and things like that. It's not that those are bad, and that's actually typically what's done in non-experimental studies, but they have a lot of limitations, and it's important to understand those limitations. So again, when people talk about research and they don't tell you these different important issues, you really can't make judgments of how important that study was, and you especially shouldn't make judgments of your choices and the choices you're going to make based on those studies. So here's just some definitions of those different sampling techniques if you'd like to look into those a little bit further. Another really important aspect of quantitative alignment is what we call scales of measurement. And then here's another one. Sometimes they're called levels of measurement, but they mean the same thing. So these are really important to ensure alignment, because depending on your scale of measurement within your data, that will change your analysis. We can't do a lot of parametric statistical analyses on nominal and ordinal data. And so it's really important to understand what your level of measurement is as well. And then kind of the last part of this alignment issue is to align your analysis. So this is probably the most difficult part for students. So just ensure you're working with your faculty. The Academic Success Center has great statistics coaches, and you can get help with this. So try not to not do quantitative research just because you're not super familiar with statistics, because there's a lot of help out there for you. The main thing I just wanted to note is that every statistic answers a different type of research question, and it's aligned to a different type of design. So it's really important to ensure you get the correct analysis for your study. So for instance, an independent t-test is looking at the difference between two completely independent groups. So, like in that first research question, we have two completely independent groups. You can't be in two different groups at the same time, or at least the researcher is not putting you in two different groups at the same time. And you're wanting to see if there's a significant difference between those two groups. And then a paired t-test is to see like a before and after type score. So you have a group of participants, they all do, say, a mindfulness training, and then you take a post-test and you see if that mindfulness training had an effect. So again, they all have just different things that they're measuring, and so it's important to ensure alignment there. And then one other thing I'll say about analyses is that every parametric test, so those are kind of considered, for lack of a better word, kind of the best tests, but they all have really pretty strict assumptions in order to do that test. And so you'll learn how to do analysis for those assumptions. And then if those assumptions are violated, then you need to do a non-parametric test. So they have a little looser assumptions to do those tests. And every parametric test has a non-parametric test equivalent, but you don't want to jump to using a non-parametric test first. All right, good. I left enough time for questions. I was worried getting through there. That's a lot. I mean, I just kind of scratched the surface of basic quantitative design. There's so much, both with quantitative and qualitative, to doing a quantitative study correctly. So I hope I got that across. Those are some of the basics, but I think one of the biggest flaws out in the world today is people hearing a research study said this or a statistic said this and just believing it. Because there's so many aspects that go into actually designing a good quality study. But just take it one step at a time. Hopefully that wasn't too overwhelming, what I just shared. If you take it kind of those baby steps, one step at a time, I think it's just a lot more manageable. All right, well, I will open it up to questions. Again, I can't answer anything specific about like an assignment or your thesis or your dissertation, but I can answer kind of general questions if you'd like, if anybody has any.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Dr. Lloyd. So we do have one in the Q&A, and it's about figuring out the optimal size of your sample.
Good question. So that's actually, I mean, I don't want to say easy, but there's really only one answer for that in a quantitative study, is you want to do a power analysis. So we can't just guess. It's really important in quantitative research with most things not to just guess on something. And so you want to run what we call a power analysis. And if you want to Google G power, it's just a big G and then power. That's probably the most common and easiest one to learn. You essentially just type in a few aspects of your study design and it pops out your minimum sample size for you. And so the reason why we want to choose sample size in quantitative studies based on power is because it's really great if you go throughout the whole study, you have a significant statistical result. But if it also doesn't have power, then that statistical significance really can't hold weight on its own. So for instance, like if you have a really small sample of like 10 people, you can still find a statistically significant effect. But how valuable is that to just know something based on 10 people? Now, I'm not saying in qualitative studies, the whole reason for qualitative studies is to test individual uniqueness and have like 10, a sample size of 10, because where quantitative research has a flaw is that not everybody fits in these averages, right? So we don't want to dismiss people that fit outside of the average. We want to know that information as well. But the whole point of quantitative research is to find those kind of averages, what's typical, that typical person that watches a lot of TV while they're studying, what happens then. But yeah, so do a power analysis and that will tell you your minimum sample size.
We don't have anything else at this time, but I did have a question I was wondering about, simply because it is something that seems to be asked often, since we do have students in the in the ADE versus the DSE. So you've got the applied doctoral and you've got the doctoral student experience. Is there any difference in, a quantitative study between the two? Is there anything recommended for one over the other?
Yeah, great question. So, in general, regardless of program, topic, anything like that, quantitative research and good quantitative research is good quantitative research. So, the best practices stay the same. So that's why, I mean, I've done dissertation chair work and academic reader on dissertations for many years, and I've gotten students with all sorts of different topics and all sorts of different programs. And because the methodology stays the same, it doesn't matter. I don't even have to know what you're talking about to be able to guide you through a research study. We have subject matter experts that are really good that kind of come in that are experts on your subject, because it's not that that's not important. You have to be describing literature correctly and including the best literature on your topic. But the methodology is the same. And so I would say, as far as your question and whether you're in either of those two programs, the quantitative research is the same, but the requirements are different. So just make sure, like, both of those different groups have different templates. There are different types of templates and requirements that go in each, because the focus is just different. What you need to explain is different. I believe in one, your requirement for a literature review is 30 to 60 pages, and the other one it's 16 to 30 pages. And it's just because focuses are a little bit different. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's the difference between those two on literature reviews. So there's just some differences like that. There's also one of the other, I'll say, main difference is if you're a PhD or an EDD, because PhD is generally, they have more rigorous requirements. But it's not necessarily that it's better. It's just that they have different rigor concentrations, because people that get EDDs, their focus is to go in and make positive change in schools. So it's more conceptual how they make a difference within schools, versus a PhD is more theoretical. And so you really have to understand theory and how theory applies to research. And the focus there then is to typically either go teach, like in higher ed, or do research. And so it's a lot more heavily research based. So if you look at the different requirements there, I think PhD generally looks a little more difficult and time consuming, but again, they're both highly respected. It's just that the focus is different. You really have to understand more with theory and research to get a PhD. So your framework especially is going to be very different. In an EDD dissertation, you're going to do a conceptual framework where you're basically building a model, versus in a PhD, you have to build a really convincing argument for a theoretical framework, which not only describes a theory, but you actually have to give evidence and support how your research is going to add to the actual theory, which is pretty difficult to do. So yeah, those are the main differences.
Perfect, thank you. We do have another one in the Q&A. Back to sample size. Is there such a thing as a maximum sample size?
That's a great question, because I think a lot of novice researchers assume the more participants, the better. And that's not the case at all. We do want a large enough sample. Your study will have more power, so more strength to it, if you have a large enough sample. But you can basically show significance with anything if you have a really large sample. So that's a problem. I mean, what good is a research study that shows significance regardless of what you're studying? Because we're going to find the smallest, if there is a difference, if there is a significant difference, if there is a significant effect, and it's just super, super, super small, you're going to find it if you have 5,000 participants. And so researchers, like seasoned researchers that know what they're doing, will look at a study that has 1,000 sample size, and they'll question it. They'll question that, because yeah, you can find significance in anything that's a large enough sample. So you do want to be really careful for that. That doesn't mean large samples are always inherently bad, but it's something that you need to look into a little bit more and look at how they designed it, look at how they set up the analysis, because it does raise a little bit of a red flag if you have like 5,000 participants. Again, don't hear that as meaning that that's always a bad thing either. There's a lot of really good studies that are, especially longitudinal studies in like for the CDC and things like that, that have huge amounts of participants. But they set up the study in quality ways to where that's okay. And they set up the statistical analysis in very strong ways. And then they explain all of it in very clear ways. So it's not like that's necessarily bad either. But yeah, there absolutely is a point where too many participants is not necessarily a positive thing.
Thank you for answering that. I do not see anything else in the Q&A or the chat. I want to give everyone a chance to put any other questions in there. Anyone want to come off mute and ask a question? No pressure. Okay.
Sounds
Well,
like they're all ready to go and go do their
they are.
quantitative study. It's great.
We do have someone who put in the chat, they did not fully understand why large samples could be bad. And that's because you can find pretty much a statistical significance somewhere in that large sample, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so we're talking extremely large samples there, where if there is even a minute difference between whatever phenomena you're studying, you'll find that. And so that's not necessarily important. I mean, we don't want, say if you study for 100 hours a week or you study for 5 hours a week, there's just a super, super small difference, like maybe 0.001 increase in your grade. Do you really want to study 100 hours versus 5 hours? Oh, probably most of you don't. And so when you have a huge sample size, even if there's a super small difference in the effect, you're going to find that because you just have so many people that you're studying and all these individual differences. And so you're going to find these super small effects. And so going along with that, that's another really important statistical concept that we look at as statisticians. It's called the effect size. So not only do we want to know if there's a statistical difference, but we want to know what the effect is. And most of the time, if it's showing this super small effect size, then you can just make a better judgment on, do I really want to study that extra 95 hours to have, the super small effect? And so it goes hand in, a lot of things with statistics go hand in hand. Although in most beginning statistics classes, you only talk about the basics like have a large sample size and have a statistical significance. Because there's just a lot to know. So teachers are trying to kind of give you the basics there. But as you get more and more in depth, there's a lot of different things to be looking at. There's effect sizes, there's power, there's statistical significance, there's all these different things. And so yeah, kind of a general rule is the larger sample size, the better, because then it can help generalize to a wider range of people.
Mhm.
I mean, the problem with early research, and I'm talking, not much more than 20, 30 years ago, was that they only studied one group of people, and it was typically a very small sample size. And then, like I explained, I mean, how are we going to then make these generalizations about all people if we're only studying a very small amount, a very small, group of people? And so that is kind of a general rule to have a larger sample size, but there is just a point where it's not super helpful and it can actually start just finding those super minute effects that aren't important. And then we've got this flip side to small effect sizes as well. And so there's all these kind of caveats with research as well. And I don't want to kind of overwhelm you with all of them. But for instance, sometimes small effect sizes are really important as well. I mean, if you think about baseball, the difference between making 100,000 a year and 8 million, dollars a year for these pro baseball players actually is a very, very small effect in how well they bat and all of those things. But over the course of an entire season, that small effect adds up to the difference between a really important player and, kind of an average professional player. So there's just all these different aspects that go into statistics. But again, kind of your basic statistics classes will tell you, the most important, the kind of general things like bigger sample sizes are better than small sample sizes.
Thank you. Last one right now I see is, when is ANOVA used?
Yeah, great question. So an ANOVA is pretty much the same thing as an independent samples t-test. They're looking at whether there's a significant difference between groups. The only difference is that an independent samples t-test can only handle 2 groups, and an ANOVA can handle 2+ groups. So in the research question on, is there a significant difference between males and females, you would do an independent samples t-test, because those are 2 independent groups. You got males in one group, females in another group, and you're trying to see if there's a significant difference between some kind of dependent variable between those 2 groups. Now, if I wanted to add more genders and be more inclusive, that there's more than 2 genders out there, I could have multiple groups. I could have 4, 5, 6 different groups. And so when you have more than 2 groups like that, but you still want to see if there's a significant difference between those groups on whatever dependent variable you're looking at, then you would run an ANOVA.
All right, well, that is all I see.
Great. Well, it's good being here with you all today and talking about one of my favorite things, which is quantitative research.
Well, definitely thank you for being here and helping us all understand that quantitative research does not have to be scary, that we can all do it. And I just want to remind everyone that we will go ahead and post the recording in the Graduate Study Support Center, usually within 24 hours. It's on the Skill Up page. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, Dr. Lloyd. We appreciate you.
You're welcome. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.